Imagine being the man who cleans the floors, carries the bags, and stands by the gate, doing what everyone else deems the unimportant work. But what if one day, that same man ends up in the bed of the very woman he's meant to serve, the boss's wife? And what if, to top it off, she's carrying his child? Now, picture this. A marriage falling apart, a husband who's checked out, and a wife who's desperate to find comfort where she can. And then, enter the Gateman. A simple man, naive to the power dynamics at play, thinking he's just doing his job. Little does he know, he's about to flip the world upside down in a way he could never imagine. This is not just a story of betrayal, deceit, and the unexpected consequences of a momentary lapse in judgment. Oh no! This is a tale that will make you question loyalty, power, and what it really means to be in control. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this one plays out. Stick around, and don't forget to subscribe to Savannah Storytime. The real drama is just getting started. In the heart of Amakwo City, a place where the old world meets the new, the contrasts are sharp. Modern skyscrapers loom tall alongside humble, bustling markets. Amidst this backdrop of gleaming glass and sun-kissed streets, Mora Odion and Odion begin their journey as husband and wife. Mora, a daughter of privilege, comes from a family whose wealth and influence stretch far beyond the city's borders. Her family, though, has always been protective, watching her closely and questioning every decision she makes. When Mora fell in love with a man with humble beginnings but sharp ambition, her family didn't take kindly to it. They disapproved of the match, voicing their concerns at every turn. Yet, with a quiet resolve, Mora stood firm, her heart certain of the man she had chosen. In the end, her defiance won, and and Mora married, their love defying the objections that had been hurled her way. In those early years, Mora trusted fully. She had inherited a large fortune from her family's successful palm oil empire, and, despite her family's doubts, she had entrusted with managing it all. The business was thriving, and together they built a life of comfort and success, with at the helm. His sharp business sense, combined with Mora's inheritance, led to a prosperous future. The Odion mansion, standing tall in the heart of Amakwo City, was a testament to wealth and opulence. Its marble floors, gilded furniture, and high ceilings gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, but within the grandeur of the home, a sense of neglect began to seep through the cracks, unnoticed by anyone but Mora. For the first 2 years of their marriage, everything seemed perfect. Was the ideal husband, charming and attentive, and always loving in ways that seemed to outshine his beginnings. But now, came home late more often, and his excuses became vague, never quite explaining where he had been or what he had been doing. Mora noticed the change in him long before he acknowledged it. At first, she tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a phase, that maybe the pressures of their wealth and business were getting to him. But the more time passed, the more it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't long before she decided to confront him. She started, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "You've been coming home late. We barely speak anymore. What's going on?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, his face hardened, and the words came, sharp and defensive. "Stop controlling me, Mara," snapped, his eyes narrowing. "You're always questioning me. I can't breathe." Her heart dropped, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she expected. "I'm not controlling you," she said softly, her voice betraying the hurt she felt. "I'm just worried about us. About our marriage." But wasn't having it. His frustration flared, and before she could even respond, he threw out a suggestion that felt as dismissive as his tone. "Maybe we should get a maid, someone else to take care of the house. You don't need to worry so much." The word stung. Mara, never one to allow anyone to dictate her actions, felt her anger simmering beneath the surface. I don't need a maid, Uzo. I just need you here. I need us to talk. The conversation quickly spiraled, with Uzo brushing aside her concerns and throwing out another solution in an attempt to shut her down. All right, he muttered, clearly uninterested. I'll bring in a gateman from my village to help around the house. You can stop worrying, and we won't have to fight about this anymore. Mara felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. A gateman. She had trusted him with her inheritance, giving him control over their finances, and now he was suggesting someone from his village to help around their house. But she held her tongue, though her insides twisted. She could tell this was just the beginning. Whatever had changed in Uzo was only going to get worse from here. The man she once loved seemed to be slipping away, and she feared she was losing him, not to someone else, but to himself. The journey from the city to the village was a stark contrast, as the vehicle passed from the bustling urban streets of Amakwo City into the dusty roads and green stretches of farmland. Uzo had begged Mara to pick the gateman from the village, giving the excuse of an urgent meeting with some investors. Getting to the address Uzo sent her, she spotted a young man with a deep, warm complexion and eyes that often carry a quiet curiosity, holding his bag tightly. Are you Chiyoke? Mara asked. He responded, Yes, madam, you are right, his eyes wide with wonder, unable to conceal his amazement at the sights around him. Wow, see your fine car. Mara neglected his compliments, and as she took his bag to drop in the booth, Chiyoke exclaimed. Oh! Look at this, pointing at the automatic boot of Mara's car. What's this button now? The door opens on its own like magic. In the village, we have to lift the doors with our own hands. Mara chuckled, glancing back at him, amused by his fascination. You'll get used to it, she said with a warm smile. But this car, it opens itself. Chiyoke laughed, his deep, infectious voice filling the space in the car. He entered, leaning forward. As they left the dusty parts of the village and into the city, Chiyoke squinted out the window at the towering buildings rising up in front of him. And these buildings? How did they even build these things? Are they sure they won't fall? Mara laughed again, her earlier tension easing in the face of his childlike curiosity. No, they won't fall. These buildings are solid, Chiyoke. It's just like how your village has strong huts, but much bigger. He heard some strange sounds and looking up, saw an airplane. Those flying birds. How do they do that, madam? Back in the village, we only see those in the sky, and we just say prayers for them. Chiyoke said, pointing up with his eyes wide open. Mara's laughter rang out once more. Those aren't birds, Chiyoke. They are airplanes. They fly because of engines and wings. You'll learn about all of this soon. Chiyoke smiled, but there was an innocence to his words that revealed just how little he knew of the world he was about to step into. His humor was simple, but it cut through the thickening air of tension between Mara and her husband, Uzo. She hadn't realized how much she needed the lightness he brought until now. For a moment, it felt like things might return to normal. In the next few weeks of Chiyoke in the city, Mara started teaching him to drive. She could tell he was eager to learn, though hesitant behind the wheel. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, eyes darting nervously between the road and the car's controls. You just press the brake gently, Mara explained. And when you're ready to go, you press the gas pedal. Like this. Chiyoke followed her instructions, his movement stiff at first, but gradually he began to gain confidence. As they moved through the city's streets, with Chiyoke behind the wheel, they laughed together. It felt almost like they were both getting a new lease on life, her teaching him the way of the city, and him showing her a side of life she'd almost forgotten, simplicity, humor, and wonder. By the time they reached their home, Chiyoke had managed to park the car without hitting anything, and Moro couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for him. The Odion mansion had once been a place of warmth, laughter, and love, but now it stood silent, filled with an ever-deepening sense of tension. Uzo had become a stranger to his wife, Moro. Especially now that they had hired a gateman. It had become too glaring to ignore. He would leave without a word, only to return days later with no explanation. 3 days this time. No calls, no messages. Just silence, and that was the loudest thing of all. Chiyoke, who had grown more comfortable in his role as the family servant, noticed the atmosphere. He watched the comings and goings of Uzo with a sense of suspicion that matched the unease swirling inside the house. One evening, Uzo asked Chiyoke to drive him out to an urgent meeting. As they got to the location, it was a hotel. Uzo instructed Chiyoke not to step out of the car until he's back. But as Uzo entered, Chiyoke became curious and followed him quietly. However, he couldn't make it past the reception. He inquired from a receptionist, posing to praise his boss. That was when he knew there was no meeting going on in the section Uzo entered. "He's a regular customer here with his assistant," the receptionist added. "I just love my boss," Chiyoke added and retreated into the car. Days later at the mansion, Moro had grown weary of Uzo's actions. She couldn't figure out what he was up to, at least, not yet. Chiyoke, ever the joker, had no idea how close he was to revealing the truth. When Moro asked him where Uzo had gone, his mouth, always quick to offer a jest, spoke without thinking. "He's knacking his assistant," Chiyoke blurted out, his tone light, as though he were commenting on the weather. The words slipped from his mouth without hesitation, and it was too late to take them back. Moro froze, her blood running cold at the sudden clarity of the statement. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart already racing with the implications of his words. Chiyoke, realizing too late that he had said too much, smiled awkwardly, trying to deflect the conversation with one of his usual jokes. But Moro was not laughing. Her face was a storm cloud of fury and disbelief. "What do you mean by that? Tell me everything you know," she pressed, her eyes narrowing. Chiyoke, now caught in his own words, could feel the pressure mounting. But he had no choice but to spill the truth, revealing everything he had seen and heard, though his jovial nature struggled to mask the gravity of the situation. He recounted the hotel and the many lies, much to Moro's horror. The information felt like a slap in the face, but it also opened her eyes to the truth she had been unwilling to see for so long. The heavy silence in the house is broken only by the faint sound of the clock ticking in the background, as Moro waits for Uzo's return. The tension is palpable, the walls of the mansion echoing the unspoken truths that hang in the air. It had been 8 long days since Uzo had last set foot in their home. 8 days of unanswered calls, empty beds, and a growing sense of betrayal that weighed heavily on Moro's heart. Today, she would confront him. She would no longer live in the shadow of his silence. Finally, the sound of the front door creaked open, and Uzo's familiar steps echoed in the grand hallway. Moro stood still, her hands trembling as she watched him enter, his face still marked in the arrogance he always wore. "I've been waiting for you," Moro said, her voice steady, but the words hung heavy between them. "Where have you been?" Uzo let out a sigh, brushing past her without so much as a word. He was unshaven, his clothes disheveled, and his demeanor was anything but apologetic. He flopped down on the couch, clearly avoiding her gaze. "I've been busy," he muttered, but it was clear he wasn't going to elaborate. Moro's heart pounded. She had given him every opportunity to come clean, but his silence had pushed her to the brink. With shaking hands, she grabbed the 2 tickets that had unknowingly fallen out of his jacket pocket. She stared at them, the words "Dubai" printed clearly across the front, mocking her. Uzo's eyes widened as he saw what she was holding. Uzo, she said, her voice shaking now, you went to Dubai with another woman, didn't you? He froze, the mask slipping for just a moment. But the hesitation was all it took for Mora to see the truth. Answer me, she demanded, her voice rising, the storm she had been holding back finally breaking free. Uzo stood up abruptly, his temper flaring as he snapped, don't you dare talk to me like that. You're not my boss. In a split second, the argument erupted into a full-blown confrontation. Uzo, in a burst of rage, shoved Mora hard, sending her crashing into the edge of the table. Her head struck the sharp corner, a sickening thud ringing in her ears as the room spun. For a moment, everything went black. When Mora came to, she found herself on the floor, her head throbbing with a dull ache. The pain was unbearable, but the hurt in her chest, betrayal and fury, was worse. As she tried to stand, Chiyoke, who had been standing quietly by the door, rushed in. His eyes, usually full of humor and light, were now steely with anger as he knelt beside Mora. Boss, he yelled, stepping between her and Uzo. What the hell is wrong with you? Uzo was sitting, his face flushed with rage. He looked at Chiyoke as if he had never seen him before, his voice a low growl. Get out of my way, don't you know who you're talking to? But Chiyoke wasn't backing down. No. You've crossed the line. You don't hit a woman. Uzo's eyes darkened. You'd better get out of here before I make you. But Chiyoke stood firm, his body tense, ready to protect Mora at all costs. Uzo, seeing that he wasn't going to intimidate the gateman. You'll leave this house before morning, Uzo backed, as he stormed out of the house. Chiyoke turned back to Mora, concern etched on his face. Do you want me to take you to the hospital? But Mora, still clutching her head, shook her head. No, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment I enter the hospital, my family will be alerted and they'll only make fun of me. Tears stung her eyes as she sat back against the wall, her mind spinning. She had waited so long to have the life she dreamed of, and now it was all unraveling. Her marriage was falling apart, her trust had been shattered, and her heart was broken. That night, Mora sat in the dimly lit living room, her mind racing, heart heavy with unanswered questions. She started shivering, a deep, unshakable coldness that seemed to have seeped into her bones. She reached for the phone on the table, her fingers brushing the screen before tapping the contact she hadn't expected to call. Chiyoke. When he picked up, his voice was low, unsure. Madam, is everything all right? Can you come here? I need someone, she whispered, her voice faltering as the words left her lips. She didn't want to seem weak, but the pain inside her was more than she could bear alone. Minutes later, Chiyoke arrived, his presence almost immediately comforting. He sat beside her, the warmth of his body providing a strange kind of solace she hadn't realized she was longing for. For a while, they sat in silence, the air between them charged, both of them aware of the unspoken understanding that had quietly grown between them. Chiyoke, unsure of how to comfort her, finally spoke, his voice gentle. You're not alone, madam. You never have to be. Mora leaned into him, just slightly, feeling the moment stretch between them, pulling them closer. Her heart beat faster now, a mix of longing, anger, and something she hadn't expected to feel. The coldness that had plagued her seemed to melt away in that instant, replaced by something else entirely. The need for comfort, for something real, something untainted by the lies and the betrayal she had been living with, overwhelmed her. Without thinking, she pressed herself into him. The emotions that had built up between them exploded in that one moment, and before she could stop herself, they were tangled in an unexpected intimacy. Neither of them said a word, and the world outside the mansion seemed to disappear. The night passed in a blur, and when morning came, the reality of what had happened settled between them like a stone. Both of them on the same bed, unsure of what to say, the weight of the unspoken truth heavy in the air. Chiyoke looked at her, his eyes wide, still processing the turn of events. Not thinking, he rushed out of the room picking up his clothes. But Mara, for reasons she couldn't explain, was calm. Her eyes held a strange peace, as though she had already known this moment would come. She didn't flinch, didn't offer apologies, or make excuses. The weight of the situation needed time to settle. But in her heart, she knew one thing for sure: the world she had known, the life she had built, would never be the same again. The grand Odion estate stood in silence, its empty halls echoing the absence of the family that once occupied them. Mara sat alone in the pristine living room, her gaze fixed on the empty space before her, her body aching and weary. For weeks, she had been sick, her condition had worsened, but she had masked it, pushing through the fatigue with self-medication. Chiyoke, on the other hand, had run away since their time together, back to the village, Uzo oblivious to what had happened. Mara's mother, Mrs. Ifeomo, hadn't been in the country for over 10 years. A woman of immense wealth and power, she had stayed away, holding on to her resentment toward Mara's marriage. The distance between them had only grown with the years, but now, drawn by an instinctual worry for her daughter, Mrs. Ifeomo had returned, unaware of the secrets that had unfolded during her absence. The moment Mrs. Ifeomo stepped into the house unexpectedly, she could sense something was wrong. Her sharp eyes studied her daughter, and in a flash, she knew that something was terribly wrong. "Mara, my child," Mrs. Ifeomo's voice broke through the silence, laced with concern. "You've been ill. Why didn't you call me?" Mara smiled faintly, but there was no joy behind her eyes. "I've been managing, Mom," Mara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Ifeomo's gaze softened for a moment, but her motherly instincts kicked in. "We are going to the hospital now. This has gone on long enough." Within minutes, they were in Mrs. Ifeomo's sleek car, speeding toward the hospital. The towering skyscrapers of Amakwo City blurred past them. At the hospital, the diagnosis was swift: Mara was pregnant. The doctor's words hung heavy in the air, and Mrs. Ifeomo, initially taken aback, could only nod. She smiled at first, her joy at the news of her daughter's pregnancy evident. Finally, after years in marriage. Mara hesitated, the weight of her secret pressing down on her chest. "It's not Uzo," Mara confessed, her voice steady but firm. "It's Chiyoke. The Gateman." Mrs. Ifeomo's face contorted with disbelief. "What? Who's Chiyoke?" she asked. When Mara told her mother all that had happened, her mother's fury was palpable. Mrs. Ifeomo's pride, her wealth, her family's legacy, all of it seemed to unravel in an instant. "Uzo. That man," she hissed. "I've always known he was no good." Without another word, Mrs. Ifeomo picked up the phone, dialing the family's lawyer with precision. "Prepare the divorce papers for Mara, now," she commanded, her voice cold and businesslike. "Strip Uzo of every last entitlement he's been enjoying from our family. I will not let him destroy my daughter's life." Mara sat silently, allowing her mother to take control. She knew this was the beginning of the end for Uzo. But for her, it was also the start of a new chapter, a chapter that, despite the pain and betrayal, held the promise of something she had long been denied: control over her own fate. Mrs. Ifeomo stood tall, her eyes hardening with determination. "We'll fix this, my daughter. And when we do, Uzo will have nothing left." And with that, the wheels were set in motion. The Odion family business, their wealth, and their legacy were all about to shift in ways that no one, least of all Uzo, could ever have imagined. The village was a world apart from the city. Nestled at the edge of rolling hills, Chiyoke's village stood as a quiet testament to the simplicity of rural life. Mara, 6 months pregnant, made the long journey to the village, her heart heavy with more than just the life growing inside her. Her mission here was one of both closure and hope, the hope that, perhaps, this visit could change everything. As she arrived at the edge of the village, the rhythmic sounds of drums and music echoed through the streets, drawing her attention. She followed the lively tunes and laughter, reaching a small clearing where Chiyoke was dancing and swaying to the beat, completely unaware of the monumental visit. His carefree movements and radiant smile stood in stark contrast to the tension Moro carried, a stark reminder of the carefree life he had lived before everything changed. Moro watched for a moment, a soft smile playing on her lips as she watched Chiyoke, the simple man who had come to play a far greater role in her life than she had ever anticipated. She admired his unburdened joy, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The moment he saw her, the music stopped. His smile faded into confusion, and he quickly wiped his hands on his pants, trying to act as though nothing had changed. "Madam?" Chiyoke asked, his voice tinged with surprise and a bit of apprehension. He stepped forward, his bare feet crunching against the dry earth, trying to gather himself. He had never imagined a visit like this. Moro stood before him, her hands gently resting on her swollen belly. "I need to speak with you, Chiyoke," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the words she was about to say. "I want you to come back to the city with me. You deserve a life that's more than this. I want you to receive a proper education, to live the life beyond this village. You want me to come to the city with you?" Chiyoke asked, his voice low, uncertain. Moro nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "I know it's a lot to ask, but there's no one else. You are the father of my child, Chiyoke." Chiyoke stood frozen for a moment, the silence between them stretching long and heavy. He had become a father by mistake. With a slow, trembling motion, Chiyoke dropped to one knee before her, the dust rising in the air around him. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I will go. I'll do whatever it takes to mend my mistakes, madam." Moro reached down, lifting his chin so their eyes met. "Please don't call me madam. You're the father of my unborn child." With a soft smile, Chiyoke stood, his heart heavy with uncertainty but filled with a strange sense of purpose. "Then I'll go with you. Whatever it takes." Moro nodded, a sense of relief washing over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with Chiyoke by her side, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. As the wheels of the car rolled away, leaving the quiet village behind, Chiyoke and Moro's journey was far from over. It was the beginning of something new. In the end, this was a story of choices, the choices we make when we're pushed to the edge, the choices that define us and shape our futures. It's about the price of power, the cost of ambition, and the bitter truth that not everything gained is truly ours. Life has a way of humbling even the proudest, reminding us that the truth always has a way of rising to the surface. So, as this chapter closes, I leave you with this: never underestimate the power of resilience. Never doubt that the world can change, no matter how small you may feel. Your story is still being written. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you've enjoyed this tale, don't let it be the last. Subscribe to Savannah Storytime, because every story we share has the power to open your eyes, stir your heart, and remind you that even the most unexpected twist can lead to the greatest transformations.